August the 27th, 2003. We're at the Atlanta History Center. This is Francis Westbrook, a staff member, with Irving Shoenberg, a veteran. Mr. Schoenberg, please give us your name, spell your last name, and give us your current address.
Irving B. Shoenberg, birthday 5 November 1925.
Thank you. Mr. Schoenberg, would you like to begin by telling us how you began your military service?
Yes, I would. First of all, I consider myself part of the greatest generation. I graduated from high school in 1943, and my contemporaries all knew that they were going to go in the military. World War II was very much on the way, or in progress. And at that age, and having graduated from high school, there was no question you were either going to be drafted or you were going to enlist or in some way get into the military. Well, I began my military service actually as what was called the Army Specialized Reserve Training Program. The Army had a program that in which we were tested, and if you passed the test and were accepted, the Army sent you to the university, to a university. And the objective was to get you the education you needed to become an engineer, an Army engineer. And we needed Army engineers for World War II. So I was accepted in the program as a reservist. I went to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and was indoctrinated and sent out to Lawrence, Kansas, the University of Kansas. I was there for about 6 months. But just prior to going to the University of Kansas, I received a nomination to West Point by my congressman, Bill Cole, as a first alternate. And the system was that a principal was nominated by the congressman or the senator, it's both. My principal nominee was a young man that I knew in my hometown, St. Joseph, Missouri. He came from a very wealthy family. His parents had given a lot of money to the campaign of the congressman, and so he was given the principal nomination. They sent him off to a prep school, which had a very high success rate. And in the meantime, I went into the Army. After I'd gotten to the University of Kansas and had my nomination was on record, the military academy sent me a letter and said that if you would like to go into a prep school, a West Point prep school, as an Army enlisted man, then we can do that for you. So I grabbed that opportunity and was enlisted into the Army, not the reserves, but into the Army. That was in December of 1943. And they sent me to Cornell University at Ithaca, New York. I was there for about 6 months. We took mathematics and English and history and a bunch of other subjects that were supposed to help you pass your examinations to get into the military academy. Well, with the 6 months that I'd had at the University of Kansas, I discovered that I could submit those to the military academy, and it would be proof that I could do college-level work. So I got what was called a dog ticket, which meant that I was excused from taking any examinations, except for the physical and the aptitude test. So I was excused from taking the examinations. Well, meanwhile, I was at Cornell University and waiting to hear what was my fate to be. It was going to go in either one of two directions. One, I would either get into West Point, or I would probably be sent to an infantry unit getting ready for the invasion of Normandy, because I was, at that point in my life, I was real fodder for combat. Well, my principal, for whatever reason, failed to pass these examinations, and I was accepted into West Point in 1944. Entered West Point in 1944. With the class of 1947, West Point was then on a 3-year curriculum because they needed officers for the war. Well, when the war ended in 1945, the Army decided that they would go back onto the 4-year curriculum. So they had to split my class, the class of 47, into the class of 47 and 48. So half the class was going to graduate in 4 years, but other half of the class would graduate in 3 years. Well, I was five numbers from the middle of the class below the cutoff point, which meant that I was going to get 4 years. The academy did a very good thing. They asked all of my classmates if they wanted a 4th year at the academy, and surprisingly, a good many of them said they would like to stay for the 4th year. And among those were classmates that already had master's degrees, if you will believe, who came to West Point with a master's degree. Not all of them, but several of them. And others who had had college, like me. So I graduated in 1948. But in 1947, the Defense Act of 1947 was passed, and it established the United States Air Force as a separate branch. So instead of being commissioned into the United States Army, I was commissioned in the United States Air Force. And 40% of my class was commissioned in the United States Air Force, because there was no Air Force Academy, and there was no source of regular officers. And my intention was to go to flying training. In fact, I had applied at the recruiting office in St. Joe, my hometown, before I went to the University of Kansas for Aviation Cadet training program. Well, they said, yeah, you could probably get into the program. There was a little bit of hesitation about my eyes at the time, but they said, you probably can pass. And then I talked to some graduates of the military academy, and they said, get all the courses in college you can get before you go to West Point, because it'll do you good. So I opted not to go to the aviation cadet program and went into the Cornell program instead, and then right into the West Point. And my intention was to go into the Air Force and fly. Unfortunately, my eyes never got any better, and I had that problem. Well, at one point after applying, I think it was about 5 times, I had an officer who was willing to certify that I was qualified physically. And I was very happy about the fact that I was finally going to get to go to flying training. But I had a bad dream that night that I was flying a very large airplane with a lot of people on board, and I didn't see the runway well enough, and we'd crashed. The next morning I told the major, who was willing to sign off on that piece of paper, that I didn't think he ought to do that because it was not fair, and I never went to flying training. But from that point on in the Air Force, I had a very interesting career. I first went into the Strategic Air Command. I was stationed out in the middle of Kansas. And we were under General LeMay, who probably everybody knows what he did for the Strategic Air Command. It was a very, very well-organized and a very good organization. We had people who were flying all over the world in our big bombers and ready for a war with Russia if it ever came. I went from Salina, Kansas down to Barksdale Air Force Base in Shreveport, Louisiana with my wing. The air base was closed in 1949 because they were consolidating. They put a good many units down at Barksdale Air Force Base. I was there for almost 2 years when the Korean War broke out in 1950, in June of 1950. And very shortly after that, I was on my way to Okinawa to be with the 307th Bomb Wing. I was not a flyer, so I was an administrative officer. I actually ended up being the Assistant Wing Inspector General for the 307th Bomb Wing. We were flying missions, our airplanes were flying missions from Okinawa over Korea. And we had 2 other wings that were stationed in Japan, and they were also flying missions over Japan, supporting the Army, of course, that was in Korea. When I came to the point where I had been promoted by this time to captain in the Air Force. And one day I saw a circular that had come down from headquarters of the Air Force that's saying that we're looking for ROTC instructors. Now I've got to back up a little bit. On my way overseas, I had stopped in Oakland, California to visit some members who were kind of extended members of my family, and met a young lady who was very, very attractive, I thought, with whom I corresponded when I was living in my tent in Okinawa. And my intention was to come back to Stanford University, where she was a student, and teach ROTC, and maybe something would develop from that relationship. Well, when I came back from Okinawa, I'd been overseas for about 7 months, 6 or 7 months, and I had been assigned not to Stanford University, where I had asked to be assigned, or to any school on the West Coast. They sent me to the University of Maryland, which was on the East Coast. But probably worked out just as well, because I found out when I came back from Okinawa that this young lady with whom I had some interest, had already sort of semi-engaged herself with a young man at Stanford University. She ended up marrying him, and I ended up going to the University of Maryland, which turned out to be a very good thing for me, because I began to teach ROTC. It was the largest Air Force ROTC unit in the country. We had about 2,400, 2,500 students. It was a land-grant college, and every male student had to have either 2 years of ROTC or have had military service. We had a good many who were already coming back from military service, and they were there. So I taught ROTC, and being stationed in Washington, I was asked to come over for an interview with the Air Force aide to the President. Lieutenant Colonel Draper was his name, who had flown as the pilot for General Eisenhower.
What year is this?
1954. So I went over to the White House and was interviewed, and then I got selected to be a White House aide under President Eisenhower. One of 21 social aides. You see them when you see the president or the vice, or not the vice president necessarily, but the first lady whenever they go off on a trip or are doing anything in their position. There's always one, or there is always at least one aide, in many cases 2 or 3. So I was one of 21 social aides, we were called. There were 7 Army, 7 Air Force, 5 Navy, and 2 Marine Corps officers. And I told about the picture of these 21 young men in their fancy uniforms, which I just recently uncovered again. So I spent 2 years as an aide to President Eisenhower, and really learned to respect him as a great leader. He was a man who knew his people, could call them by name, knew a lot about them, and you always felt very comfortable. Every Christmas, there was a party for the aides in the White House. And Mrs. Dowd, who was the president's mother-in-law, and of course his wife was there. And Christmas of 1955, I told President Eisenhower that I was thinking seriously of asking a young lady to be my wife. Well, it's about time. I was over 30 years of age at the time. And Mamie and Ike both said, "Oh, don't worry about it. She'll accept." I wasn't sure, but we'd been dating for about a year or 2. And so I went home, and sure enough, I got engaged. And when you get engaged or get married, no, you have to be married. But I had to abdicate my position in the White House because you can't be married and be a social aide at the White House. But that was fine because I married a young lady who has been my wife for 47 years now, and we have 3 wonderful boys.
Why do you have to be single?
Because you have to be at the social affairs, and you have to dance with the young ladies, and you don't want to be encumbered by a wife, which was okay with us because we got invited to a lot of good parties, especially during the Christmas time. So in 1954, I finished my tour of duty at, 1955, finished my tour of duty at the ROTC detachment. By the way, I got a master's degree while I was at the University of Maryland. I'd already had, of course, an engineering degree from West Point, but I got a master's degree in international relations at the University of Maryland. And I got selected by Major General Joe Kelly, who was one of the finest officers I ever served under. And probably, well, he did get to be a 4-star general, and he probably would have been the Chief of Staff of the Air Force. And from there, he probably would have been Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But he was a smoker. And when the Secretary of the Air Force told him he was going to be the next Chief of Staff of the Air Force, he was sent down to the flight surgeon's office and took an examination and came back and told the Secretary of the Air Force, Mr. Douglas, that he had to be retired because he had throat cancer. So we lost one of the best officers that I've ever known. Joe Kelly was just a great, great man. I could walk down he brought me to the Pentagon in 1954. He brought me to the Pentagon to work in legislative liaison with Congress. He was a Major General at the time, Director of Legislative Liaison. And I could walk down the hall with him, on many occasions I did. He would call everyone he saw by name. And he could tell you about their wives and their children. And he was a raconteur also. He could talk about anything, anytime, to any number of people. So I was fortunate enough to work for him on that for a couple of years. And when I finished my tour in legislative liaison, I had a career decision to make. As a non-flying officer, don't have as many choices as people who wear wings, and I never got to wear wings. They wanted me to go to navigation school, and I said, no, if I can't sit on the front porch and fly this thing, I don't want to be a member of the crew. So I had to do some serious thinking, and General Kelly was the kind of a person who said, any place you want to go in the Air Force, I will help you get an assignment. And I decided that one of the good places for me to go would be into the missile business, because you didn't have to be a pilot to be a missile man. Missiles were very, very new in those days in the Air Force, 1959 to be exact. So I became a missileer. I was sent over to Germany. I got some training, went to Germany. And by this time I was a major. Went to Germany and I became a flight commander in the 585th Tactical Missile Group, stationed at Bitburg Air Base, Germany, which is in the far western side of Germany. But we had the Mace and later the Matador missiles. The early version of a tactical missile in the Air Force was really an airplane. It was an unguided airplane, a radio-controlled airplane. It was a T-33 that had been modified, and that was the first tactical missile of the Air Force. So I was a flight commander in that unit for a while, and then my boss was a colonel I had worked with in the Pentagon, asked me to be the group executive officer, and I became the group executive officer. We were an outstanding unit in the Air Force, and I have a ribbon that says that we are an outstanding unit. And one of the prides of my service at that time was I had 10 crews, 10 missile crews, launch crews. We stood alert 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And some very, very good officers. Every one of them were graduates of college. Most of them were pilots and very good officers. And we had an excellent outfit. Well, we determined that one of the launch crews, we were going to try to make them what was called lead crew. In other words, an outstanding crew in this business of tactical missiles. And sure enough, one of my crews, under a captain by the name of Ira Hale, who still remains as one of my very close friends, big, tall Texas A&M graduate. His wife's almost as tall as he is, but they're very wonderful people down in Texas. And Ira and his crew were selected for that honor. The first one in the Air Force, the first one in Europe, and the first one ever. So after my 3 years of duty in Germany were up, I began to wonder what was going to happen to me next. So one of my classmates was stationed in the Pentagon, and I said, Jay, and he was my roommate. I said, Jay, go down to the officer personnel assignment section and see where I'm going to be sent. So he went down there and said, this is my classmate who's finishing up a tour with tactical missiles in Germany, and where are you going to send him? And he'd been and he said, and Jay said to the assignment officer, well, he was in the Pentagon before he went over to Germany. So the assignment officer said, well, the chances are good that we'll put him in Strategic Air Command with one of the strategic missiles, like the Jupiter or the Minuteman, one of those. So Jay wrote me a letter and said, that's where you can expect to go. I said, okay. My wife wasn't real happy about it because she didn't want to go to North Dakota or Wyoming. And next thing I knew, I got orders back to the Pentagon, assigned to operations in the tactical missile section. So I got in touch with Jay and I said, hey, Jay, how come you told me I was going to Strategic Air Command? I'm going back to the Pentagon. Didn't you tell him my name and where I was? He said, no, I didn't give him your name. I just told him where you were. And I said, well, if you'd have given my name, they would have told you exactly where I was going to go and when I was going to go. But he didn't, and we're still friends. In fact, I'm going to be seeing him in Washington very soon. So I came back to the Pentagon. Oh, before I left Germany, the Air Force told me that they wanted me to go down on temporary duty to Turkey, because the Jupiter missiles, which were considered a tactical, it wasn't a strategic missile, but it was a tactical missile, and that when I got to the Pentagon, I was going to be responsible for the Jupiter missiles, which were in both Italy and Turkey. I said, okay. So I went down to Turkey and was down there about a week and drove around visiting the various units that had these missiles in place. The tactical missiles that we had in Germany were aimed at Russia, obviously. They were atomic weapons. And the missiles in Turkey and Italy were also were armed with atomic weapons. So, and I tell you that because it leads to another story. When I got to the Pentagon, I was in tactical missiles. I had all the tactical missiles in the Air Force under my control in Air Force operations. We had air-to-air fired from aircraft at other aircraft, air-to-ground from the aircraft to a target on the ground, and from ground to ground. That was the Jupiter was at a ground-to-ground, and so was the Mace Matador. So in 1962, I was back in the Pentagon, and if you remember, 1962 was the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So we became very, very busy. And the outcome of that showdown with the Russians, there was a quid pro quo, and we agreed to take missiles out of Italy and Turkey, the Jupiter, if the Russians would take the missiles out of Cuba. And that's exactly what happened. Well, in my files, I just the other day checked back to see if I wasn't dreaming. I had a letter of commendation from Mr. Robert McNamara himself. I was one of 3 officers designated to receive some commendation for the work that we did to get the Jupiters out of Turkey and Italy. The other part of my job during that missile crisis, I think, is noteworthy for historical purposes. We had, as I told you, air-to-air and air-to-ground missiles. There's a missile called the Bullpup and a few others that the aircraft would launch, flying aircraft. So we were getting ready to do whatever we had to do against the Russians in Cuba. And my job was to get a whole bunch of tactical missiles down to Homestead Air Force Base in Florida so that if we ever needed them, we would have them there. And that's one of my humorous stories about the Air Force. I had a civilian at Ogden Air Force Base, Utah, who was the project manager for one of the missiles, the Bullpup Missile, which was launched from aircraft onto a target on the ground. And they came in 3 sections. The nose was red, the middle section was yellow, and the aft section was green. So they came in 3 packages. And in order to launch one of those things or to load it on board an airplane, you had to assemble it. They came in crates, and you had to take the crates off and put the 3 pieces together. So I was in communication with this civilian out at Ogden, Utah, and we decided that we'd have a color-coded system so that even if it was dark, and many of these missiles were placed in storage areas that had very little lighting. They were just open lots in many cases, but there were many of them. And I began to hear from the people who were taking care of these missiles that it was difficult to identify the red, the green, and the yellow sections in the dark, and they were having a problem. So, well, that's when we decided we needed a color-coded system so they could identify it better. And I got in touch with this man, and I said, okay, put out an Operation Immediate message and tell everybody that this is what we're going to do. And I waited for a response from my colleague out in Ogden, Utah, and I wasn't getting a response. And this was beginning to be a very serious problem. Fortunately, nothing happened operationally that we had to test our system. Finally, I got him on the telephone. I said, what have you done to comply with this instruction you got? He said, Major, do you know how many shades of green there are? And I said, I don't care how many shades of green. You pick out one and get it going. And so we got the section painted green, as it should. Red and yellow apparently were no problem. But we finally got everything in order. And we didn't have to use them, thankfully. Well, I went from the operations in the Pentagon, Air Force Tactical Missile Section, up to work for the Secretary of the Air Force. They needed somebody who could write speeches, and I could write a speech. So I got a job in the Administrative Assistance Office of the Secretary of the Air Force. And wrote speeches for the Secretary of the Air Force, a man named Eugene Zuckert, who was, again, one of my favorite people. He died a little over a year ago. But he had been chosen by John F. Kennedy to be, well, I should say, John F. Kennedy picked Mr. McNamara to be the Secretary of Defense when he got elected president. And he told McNamara that he could select anybody he wanted to be Secretary of the Army, Secretary of the Navy, Secretary of the Air Force. Well, Mr. McNamara and Mr. Zuckert had taught at Harvard University. McNamara taught management, and Zuckert, who was the lawyer, taught law. They taught a joint course of law and management together. So Mr. McNamara asked Gene Zuckert, who had been in the Atomic Energy Commission sometime not too long before that, to be Secretary of the Air Force. And I became associated with Mr. Zuckert and had a great relationship with him. After 4.5 years in office as Secretary of the Air Force, he decided to go back to his law practice. And then the next phase of my little story has to do with my third son. My wife was pregnant, and I was after I left Mr. Zuckert's office, I went to become the executive assistant to the Undersecretary of the Air Force, a man named Norman Paul. And I had to take him out to Colorado Springs, Colorado. He wanted to visit the Air Force Academy and Cheyenne Mountain, where we had all of our space control business. So we left. We were getting ready to leave to fly out to Colorado, and my wife was very close to having her child, our third son. We didn't know a son, but our third child. And so before I left, I said, "Ann, you going to be okay?" She said, "Oh, yeah." She said, "I have an appointment with a doctor." Well, to make a long story short, while I was in Colorado, she went to the hospital. And she called me I called her from, we were staying at the superintendent's quarters at the Air Force Academy. I called her to see how she was doing, and I got her in the delivery, not in the waiting room, in the preparation. And I said, "Call me when you can." Well, the telephone rang at about 2 o'clock in the morning, and the undersecretary, Mr. Paul, was in the master bedroom, and I had a smaller bedroom off to the side. The telephone rang, and I jumped out of bed. I knew exactly what it was. And I heard Mr. Paul say, "The hell you say?" The nurse had called from the hospital to tell him that his wife had just had a boy.
That's great.
And he said, "The hell you say?" Well, when we got back to Washington, I called Mr. Zuckert, the former Secretary of the Air Force. And he said, "Yeah, Shoney," he said, "I know about the new boy." And he said, "I'll tell you what. There are 3 male names in my family. One is Eugene, the other one is Martin, and Adrian. And his name was Eugene Martin Zuckert." He said, "You take any one of those names and give it to that kid, and I'll give you a real nice birthday party." Now, I got to back up a little bit more. When we went to a big Air Force thing at one of the hotels downtown Washington, and he saw my wife, who was looking very pregnant at the time. He said, "Ann, when is that baby due?" And she said, "Oh, the middle of November." He said, No, that's not good." He said, "My birthday's on the 9th of November, and I want you to have a boy." She said, "Well, I don't mind if we have it earlier than the 18th or the middle of November, but do you mind if we have a girl? We've already got 2 boys." He said, "No, it's got to be a boy." Well, guess what? My wife delivered our third son on the 9th of November, and his name is Jeffrey Howard Eugene Schoenberg. He got that name.
Right.
And for many, many years after Jeffrey was born, Mr. Zuckert called him "my boy." And he did give him a very fine birth present. So I served as the executive assistant to the undersecretary for well, I was actually the deputy assistant secretary. Then I went off to the Industrial College of the Armed Forces, which is in Washington, D.C. at Fort McNair, which is a school for the senior office, the last step in your career education. Wonderful school. Started by Bernard Baruch and President Eisenhower when he was still in the military. The purpose of the school is to train officers to think nationally and globally. How does the United States prepare industrially and logistically to fight a war, any war? So it was 9 months of very intensive study with some of the greatest lecturers I've ever heard, including Mr. Eisenhower, came over to speak to us, and secretaries of practically every department. There were officers from Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, State Department. So when we worked in our little seminars and on various projects, we had some very fine people to work with, and most interesting subjects. When I first got into computers, I learned that computers could do a lot of things from a military standpoint. Computers were very, very new when I got in the military. So I came back, well, I finished the course, And by the way, I got another master's degree while I was doing that from George Washington University. This one was in business administration. I came back to the Pentagon at the request of the Undersecretary to be his executive assistant, the #1 man in the office. And I held down that job for with three undersecretaries of the Air Force. So I had a total of 10 years in the Pentagon, which is a pretty good long time to be in the Pentagon. It's a wonderful place. You have to know it. It hurt very badly when I saw what had happened in September 11th. Well, I finished my duty in the Pentagon, and another general with whom I had worked in the Pentagon was a 4-star general in charge of Air Force Logistics Command. And he had asked me to come out there and take over an organization called the Air Force Contract Maintenance Center. With aircraft belonging to the Air Force all over the world, many of them assigned to, for example, to ambassadors in countries all over the world. Rather than bring the aircraft back to the United States to have maintenance work done or repair work done, we established detachments in many countries around the world where we could give a contract to an aircraft company, and they would do the work that had to be done on the airplane. And so I became the commander of that worldwide organization. I had detachments in Thailand, Japan, Okinawa, Israel, Europe, several places in Europe, and it was quite a chore, but it was a very, very interesting job. Not fortunately or unfortunately, I had that job for only 1 year, and then another general whom I had worked for asked for me to come down to Warner Robins, Georgia, and to take over as Director of Material Management. By this time, I was a full colonel, and a very challenging job. Warner Robins is one of the 5 major depots of the Air Force. And I had 15 divisions, each one headed up by a full colonel. The job I had was a brigadier general's job, but I never quite got promoted. I'll tell you about that. I had responsibility for many of the Air Force cargo planes, all of the aircraft, all of the computers in the Air Force, all the firefighting equipment in the Air Force, millions and millions and millions of dollars worth of equipment, 3,200 people working for me with a $1 billion a year budget. And it took a lot of doing to stay on top of that job. But I did that job for 3 years. And I was told in 1972 by 2 of the generals who were commanding 2 of the depots that I was definitely going to be promoted to brigadier general. And I was very pleased about that because I had worked very hard. When the promotion list came out, I was not on that promotion list. And there's a rule in the military that if you're going to go out and get a job in civilian world, that you ought to do it before you're 50 years of age, because corporations don't hire people at age 49 or 50. It's just very difficult to do, unless you have something very, very special going for you. So when I didn't come out on the promotion list, I decided that my oldest son, who was getting ready to go into high school, and the military has a bad way of shifting people around quite often, and it seems that the higher your rank, the more times you move. And I knew that I was going to be moving fairly often if I did get promoted. So we decided, my wife and I decided, to retire from the Air Force. That was in 1973. And we came to Atlanta, Georgia. And one of my West Point classmates was the chief executive officer of a company here in Atlanta called Abrams Industries. And he asked me to come and work for him, which I did. Became president of one of his subsidiary companies. But I got to go back to the promotion. I found out several years later that, and this was from a Major General Bobby Hale, who was down at Warner Robins, my boss at Warner Robins, that I had definitely been recommended for promotion. My name had gone up to Logistics Command. I was selected at that level. My name went to the Pentagon at the Air Force level promotion board. I was selected at that board, and my name was sent to Congress, and I was actually confirmed for promotion by the Senate. But the Air Force got the list back from the Congress and realized that there were 10 too many names on the list. and that my name was among the last 10 as what we called promotion below the zone. In other words, I was considered one of the outstanding candidates. So the last 10 names were stricken from the list, and I was one of them. Well, you know the old Yogi Berra story about when you get to the fork in the road, take it? I took that fork in the road. I came to Atlanta, Georgia, which was one of the best things that ever happened to me. And I had a very fine career with Abrams Industries for 18 years. And when I finished that job, and during that 18 years, last 8 years of that time, I was in the headquarters of the company. I was doing investor relations. Most people don't know what investor relations is, but these are the people that do the financial and public relations for companies. You know, if you have a disaster, for example, then you better get out there and explain what your problem is, and get your customers to know what your problems are and how you're going to fix it. So I had done that for about 8 years, and served with Nasdaq as the chairman of a committee in Washington on investor relations. And then when I retired from Abrams Industries, I had to drop that connection. But one of my friends was an associate dean at Emory University in the business school, and I had told him about a very great need for people to be trained in the field of investor relations. And surprisingly, in 1995, there were no schools or universities teaching anything about investor relations. And the associate dean asked me to help him establish a program. Well, we established a seminar for executives in various corporations, and went on for 5 years, was very, very successful. And I was disappointed when Emory University, the dean of the business school, didn't see the golden egg that they had going over there. And they never did anything about establishing a graduate level course or even an undergraduate level course. So after 5 years of that, I retired from that job. And then I went to another job, again, unsolicited on my part. But a friend of mine who was a partner in a firm that manufactured equipment for paging, the paging terminals and various other gadgets that go with the business. And they called me, the three partners called me in one day, and I was doing some consulting work for them. They called me in and said, you know, we know this technical business backwards and forwards, but we really don't know how to run this company. Would you run the company for us? So I said, okay. I took on the job for 6 months. My objectives were to establish to get a business plan going for them, and to find a replacement for me as the chief executive officer. So 6 months to the day, I had finished the plan and found a retired major general who was 10 years behind me at West Point, who had been in the Corps of Engineers, a very, very fine man. He took the job, and he's still with them as one of their partners. So I consider that one of my real accomplishment. So I retired from there in, I think it must have been about 97. My wife and I have been doing a lot of traveling. We've been to China. We just came back from Russia a couple of weeks ago. And she has been very much involved with the Red Cross for some 30 years. So we've traveled for the Red Cross on occasion. And I'm writing a book and trying to get around and visit my children and my grandchildren, having a great time, and playing tennis.
Would you like to say a little bit about the Vietnam era, a little bit more about the Vietnam experience?
Yes, I would.
And also the Cold War, perhaps your memories of the Cold War period.
Yes. Well, obviously, as a West Point graduate, I have many, many friends who are in the military and still do. Here in Atlanta, for example. I lost a great deal of respect for Mr. McNamara when I served in the Pentagon. He did not understand military at all. He was a numbers man. Everything to him was systems analysis. And you cannot run a war on systems analysis. Many people don't know that he spent billions of dollars during the Vietnam business building an electronic fence across Vietnam. It was a total disaster. You could walk over it. You could step across it. but it was supposed to keep the North Vietnamese from coming down. That's how it didn't work at all. And he didn't understand how to use the military. And I'm sorry to say that neither did Mr. Clinton. And I have a terrible, terrible time with Mr. Clinton. My wife and I have many arguments about that. But Mr. Clinton never served in the military, and Mr. McNamara never served in the military. And you don't really know what the military is or what it's supposed to be unless you've served in it. So we wasted an awful lot of men and materiel in Vietnam. I'm convinced that we could have stopped the war if we hadn't been so pussyfooting about it. And if you've ever read Mr. McNamara's book on his reflections on the Vietnam War, it's nothing but a bunch of excuses. And he is very sorry that he ever did a lot of the things. You know, we got into the business of counting bodies, which is ridiculous. So we didn't do a good job in Vietnam. The Cold War was terrible. Korea was, well, that wasn't a Cold War. That was a very hot war. So was Vietnam. But the Cold War really is nothing more or less than preparation and preparedness. The United States has a history of a sine curve, as I call it. My father fought in World War II, or World War I, I should say. And when he found out I wanted to go to West Point, he wasn't too happy about it because his experiences in World War I in the trench warfare was not good. But I had made up my mind that I wanted to go to West Point as a very young man and was very fortunate in getting in. But after World War I, we just let our military go to pot. General Duncan and General Truman, whom I know here in Atlanta, will tell you that when they were both stationed down at Fort McPherson, and they didn't have any trucks. They had mules and horses. And it wasn't until the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, came along, and the government gave them trucks. That's when the Army began to have trucks. So it was amazing that people like Eisenhower and Bradley and those other men stayed in the military. And had they not stayed in the military, we would have been lacking leadership for what was to come, World War II. So our history, the military history of this country is very bad. We have to learn that if we're going to be a major power in the world, you have to have a good, technologically sound military. And we learned the lessons the hard way. Mr. Clinton, my serious objections to Mr. Clinton is that he committed our troops overseas for some very poor reasons. You know, Haiti and Somalia and other places, and never really used the military the way it should have been. And we lost a lot of people. And the morale in the military was very bad at many times and had to be rebuilt. So if the president doesn't understand what the military is supposed to be doing or what it's supposed to do, and not used as a social organization, which as it has been, then we can get into a lot of trouble nationally. But if you maintain your strength, most countries in the world will understand that. I think we're beginning to see that a lot better now. We're having trouble in Iraq, but you're going to always have trouble. The Marshall Plan worked very well after World War II, and I predict that that's exactly what's going to happen, some sort of Marshall Plan in Iraq. And if we don't see the problem, Saddam Hussein was a very serious problem. They say we didn't find any war of biological warfare, it's chemical. But we know that Saddam Hussein killed 100 and some thousand people up in the northern part with gas. Now that's a chemical weapon, as far as I'm concerned. No, I'm getting into things other than military right now.
But that's interesting. It's part of the current history.
Yes, it is.
We've got about 5 more minutes, I think.
All right.
Would you like to sum up or do something?
I would like to say something else. My own experience in getting an appointment to West Point proved to me that the system was flawed. And for many, many years, if you were the son of a wealthy individual and that individual gave a lot of money to a campaign, the chances are pretty good that you could get your son into West Point. I don't say daughters because women didn't come to West Point or the Naval Academy or any of the others until much later. But my own experience was that the young man who got the principal nominee, in my case, was the son of a wealthy man. He didn't really want to go to West Point, I'm convinced. They sent him to the best prep school in the country 3 times, and 3 times he failed to get in. So I got in the first time, and 2 of my good friends got in the next 2 times. I wrote a master's thesis when I was at the University of Maryland on the subject of the appointment systems to the service academies, which basically is this. And I first read about it when John Kennedy was a congressman from Massachusetts. He got together a panel of people, a military man, a clergyman, an educator, a government worker, and other people, you know, lawyers, whatever else, people that have good heads on them and could evaluate. They would review the records of the candidates seeking appointment to the academy. They would interview them, and they would make the selection. And in the article by John Kennedy, he said that one of the candidates that he had to consider was the son of a very, very wealthy man in Boston who had given a large sum of money to his campaign. And another young man was the son of a Chinese laundryman in Boston. And guess who got the appointment? The Chinese laundryman's son, because he was the best qualified. On that basis, I wrote my thesis and got several members of Congress to adopt that system. And many of them are still doing it. In fact, I've served on Gingrich's panel. I've served on Senator Cleveland's panel. I've served on Ben Jones' panel, former congressman. I've served on Denise Majette's panel, the newly elected congresswoman. And we are getting, through that system, some of the best people we've ever gotten. Good people who are qualified, who want to go to the academy, and who, in most cases, will finish the 4 years to get their degree. But if you don't have that kind of a screening process, you're not going to get the good people. And that's one of my favorite themes, is to pick the best people to go. You know, the education is worth several $100,000. And those people will become the leaders of our country. They'll head up the military. So if we don't get good people graduating from those academies, and from the ROTC programs as well, and from the other military schools, which are mostly ROTC programs, then we're putting our country in danger, because we've got to have good leadership.
And one more quick question. Would you say a word about the Legion of Merit Award?
Yes, I was awarded that 3 times, as a matter of fact. The first one when I was leaving the office of the Deputy, or the Undersecretary of the Air Force. Well, actually 2 of them came from Undersecretaries of the Air Force. And the third one was when I retired as the Director of Material Management at Warner Robins. And I have a shadow box, you know, with all of my decorations and badges and so on. But I got to tell you that my middle son, who's a doctor, went through the medical school program that the Air Force put on and served as a flight surgeon in the first Iraq War, first Gulf War. And he's got a box that's got more medals than I have. And we're very proud of him.
So you passed it down.
Yeah. But I have 2 other sons, both of whom are lawyers. And the youngest one is Jeffrey, who was named for Mr. Zuckert, the Secretary of the Air Force. He is now Denise Majette's district director in her office. So I've got 3 very fine sons and 3 very beautiful granddaughters.
Congratulations. That's great.
Yeah.
Good. Well, thank you very, very much. We can stop now, or if you'd like to continue, we could keep going.
Oh, I think I've told you all that you really want to hear.
We're